What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So getting into Nightwing Rebirth, it's actually been a while since we covered anything Nightwing related. And the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, when it comes to Nightwing's own solo series, for the most part, he's just kind of out there in left field dealing with things on his own. And it's kind of interesting is because there really is no supporting cast here. I mean, there's Sean Sang insofar as, her basically being his love interest, but that's really about it. For the most part, when it comes to DC Comics, when we think of like Batman, for example, Batman's got Duke, in his own stories. And if he didn't, there'd be some other iteration of Robin that exists out there somewhere. Detective Comics, he teams up with other members of the Bat family. When it comes to Action Comics, you see Superman alongside other superheroes. When it comes to the main Superman story, you usually see him dealing with like Lois Lane or his son Jonathan or something along those lines. Nightwing is very much out there by himself. And the reason for this is because of the fact that with Nightwing, if you're new to DC Comics, he's currently on the Titans team. And so that really gives us the ability to see him cross over with other superheroes in a way that creates more of a full and richer story. But again, the idea here with the Nightwing Rebirth line of stories, if you're just joining us or if you're just coming across this video, is that DC has just now gone down the road of sending Nightwing back to Bloodhaven. And the reason why this matters is because before the New 52, Bloodhaven was Nightwing's own Gotham City. That's really what it was. Way back when Dick Grayson first appeared, he was Batman's sidekick for decades. Eventually, he was rolled over into becoming his own superhero called Nightwing, and then the next step was to basically give him his own city to protect. And so going into the New 52, Nightwing was the guardian of Bloodhaven. Now the issue was that when the New 52 launched, DC revamped him completely, and the result was that he was no longer the protector of Bloodhaven, he was just like the spy working for an organization called Spiral. But the idea of sending him back to Bloodhaven is designed for the purpose of creating a measure of familiarity with existing DC fans who were reading before the New 52 reboot. What it's also designed to do is give you guys something fresh if you're just now joining in or something along those lines. Now, the other half of this is that Bloodhaven is really viewed in a lot of ways as more hopeless than Gotham City. And that's kind of the crazy thing. Going pound for pound, I would say that Bloodhaven is about on par with Gotham City. It doesn't have the same kind of criminal element. Instead, what it really just has is like corruption, like governmental corruption, police corruption, different things like that. Gotham's known for the Riddler, the Joker, Two-Face, Penguin, those guys. But with the idea of Bloodhaven as it exists now, Nightwing's trying to clean up the city insofar as he's trying to fight against government and police corruption as he is trying to deal with small-time crooks. And it was always that way. Nightwing never really had his own version of the Joker or anything along those lines. It was always just dealing with trying to make sure that Bloodhaven didn't completely go to pot. Now, the other half of this is that as he's doing his nightly patrol, he basically comes across a woman who's being accosted by a guy. For me, whenever I read these comics, I always imagine things going down differently. For example, Nightwing's the one guy that can like cheer everybody up. He's the one guy who's not down and drabby and, oh man, things are just really bad. He's not that guy. He's the guy who's just like, hey, the glass is half full. And it's always kind of cool and refreshing. And it's one of the things that always made him so vibrant. The issue with this is that with this woman being accosted and Nightwing basically stopping the perpetrator, the woman grabs the perpetrator's gun and goes to shoot him. Now, of course, this results in Wally West, the classic Flash, stepping in to stop him. Now, something to keep in mind about this and something to bear when it comes to this particular story is that really Nightwing and Wally West are a couple of characters who basically know everything that's going on. Now, Wally West seems to know a little bit more, but Dick Grayson's basically been woken up to what's going on. Keep in mind, the way the whole DC Rebirth and, the New 52 work in tandem is that the New 52 was a reboot. It was basically, hey, here's all these new characters. DC Rebirth came back and said, no. Things were supposed to be the way they were before the New 52, but someone changed something. Now, classic Wally West was the guy who was just out there. He was the missing link. He was the guy who came along and said, I don't know what's going on here, but your memories have been modified. The idea is that with classic Wally West, he's really pulling double duty in terms of his life as a superhero and his personal life. Remember, his love interest was Linda. That was the whole great big huge thing before the New 52. The idea of DC Rebirth is to bring her back, but to basically do it in a way where they can more or less rekindle their relationship. And that's really what classic Wally West talks about here. His biggest issue is that he seems like he's bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders. But the idea is that this story actually kind of has a coming together of sorts, where Wally West basically sits down and says, everything is just a little too much for me to take on at the moment. I mean, I have people that I can confide in. I can talk to Barry Allen, but he's always off doing his own thing. I can't really go talk to Linda because who she is now is not who she was before. It's not the Linda that I remember. And so the cool thing about this is that what they end up doing is actually taking off to a dive bar, and then they're met by a couple of chicks. Now, I don't know what these guys are thinking. I would have been like, yeah, let's go back to like your place or my place or something, but like we're gonna work out some stress. And that's why things like this are so important. In truth, this was never really an aspect of comic books that existed for any measure of time. Really, before the 1970s, comic books were just superheroes saving the day. That's really what it was for the most part. It's just these small little moments. But the funny thing about this is that once they make their way outside, people's belongings start vanishing. And this is cool because what this story begins to do is kind of turn into like a 1960s feel with regards to these two superheroes. And the reason why I say that is, again, the era of like more dynamic powers, the era of more character-driven powers didn't really emerge until like the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that kind of a thing. And so what ends up happening here, or at least what they seem to be gathering, is that people's belongings are just kind of vanishing up in thin air. So we don't know if somebody's teleporting them out. We have no idea what the case may be. But the one-liners that come out of here, you know, the little zingers, different things like that, the references to these old school stories, names like the Skipper, things along those lines, that's all going back to the old school age of superheroes. Nightwing and the Flash versus the Skipper in the case of the Vanishing Valuables. That's a title that you would have seen in like 1961. These are all just like references to these old school comics. And again, that's the nature of DC Rebirth. The nature of DC Rebirth is to kind of fulfill a bit of nostalgia for an era of comics that people never grew up in. Most people who are reading comics right now weren't reading them in the 1960s. This wasn't really a part of their repertoire. But the idea, you know, really from Jeff Johns, the guy who's spearheading DC Rebirth, the very nature of characters back then was that there was no moral ambiguity. There was the good guy, there was the bad guy, the superhero stopped the bad guy, the day was saved, the comic was over. That's basically how those stories function. So again, this is kind of a throwback to that. And the reason why is because we just end up finding out that the person who's committing these crimes is just a guy who has the ability to manipulate time. Now, it's not an inherent power that he has. It's not something that he was simply just given or born with, or whatever the case may be. It's actually a piece of off-world technology that allows him to achieve this. But it's cool because what this does is it really gives us a glimpse of what it looks like when a person manipulates time within the comic itself. If I were to sit you down and I were to show you a person who could teleport and show you a person who can manipulate time, in terms of how your visible eye sees it, there's no difference. All you know is that they were there and now they're there. Whether it's because they stopped time and then walked over there, or whether it's because they just teleported there while you were going to attack them, it's irrelevant. The idea here is that they are basically untouchable. And that's the cool thing about this, is because this is designed to take something that's relatively small, the idea of manipulating time, give it to a small time guy, and then see what he can do with it. Now, the reason why I say this is so interesting is because when it comes to manipulating time in comic books, most fans absolutely hate it because time travel is used by a writer to write themselves out of a hole that they dug. You know, they have this amazing story and they can't figure out exactly what to do, you know, and they're like, well, I mean, how do we end this? Well, we'll just time travel. Matthew Malloy in Marvel Comics is a perfect example. This mutant that's godly powerful, and writer Brian Michael Bendis didn't know how to end the story, so he just had them go back in time and prevent Matthew Malloy from ever being born. It's an extremely lazy way to end a story. That's one of the things that fans have become accustomed to when time travel is invoked. And this, it's not that way. It's just a small time guy who figured, if I can manipulate time, I'm just gonna freeze it, steal people's stuff, and then call it a day. And it's actually pretty smart. It's actually pretty cool to see somebody using time manipulation in that fashion. Not only that, what this does is it takes someone like classic Wally West and makes him virtually powerless. Now remember, when it comes to the different iterations of the Flash, one of the things that DC's done over the years in order to differentiate the various forms of the Flash is to give them different iterations of their powers, or to make one more powerful than the other. Stealing speed from other people, time traveling, being able to jump from the future to the past, back to the present, you know, being able to use all these different abilities, moving their hands through physical objects, so on and so forth. It's really cool to see these kind of things unfold. And that's what happens with this. Classic Wally West is by and large considered to have been the most powerful version of the Flash. Now, once Barry Allen came back after he was basically resurrected during the original Flash Rebirth story, his powers were basically bolstered. And the idea was that he's now the most powerful version of the Flash. But the idea is that, again, we're talking about beings who, if DC had a designation for Omega level, they would easily be Omega level characters, and they're just being stopped by a guy who has the ability to freeze time. But again, these scenarios require that the writing be played out in a way that makes it interesting. And so what actually happens here is Dick Grayson figures it out. If this guy who's calling himself Time Bomb is basically able to control time around people, his technology is really an extension of how well he's able to focus, meaning he can't manipulate time in terms of controlling multiple people. And so what this does is it allows Dick Grayson to basically put 2 and 2 together. If he stands where he is, classic Wally West is going to die when he gets hit by this train. He's not indestructible. He's a normal human being who can be shot in the head. He's just got the speed force to run really, really fast and a healing factor. Dick Grayson is like, if I don't intervene, Wally West is gonna die. Because Wally West is so fast, he literally steps in, pushes him out of this sphere of influence, and then in the blink of an eye, Wally West grabs him and saves his life. So it's a gamble, but it's cool to see it pay off. And so again, what ends up happening here is Time Bomb kind of turns his attention away. This momentary distraction results in him basically being defeated. Now here's a funny thing about this Time Bomb character. This is not a villain that DC's just kind of pulling out of thin air, right? Time Bomb existed, but to say that Time Bomb is irrelevant is a overstatement. Time Bomb is about as irrelevant as a person could be. He originally made his appearance in Action Comics, I want to say it's 661, and it was a team-up story involving Superman and Plastic Man. And it was really kind of cool because it was like this really cool battle that took place between them. But it was the idea that Time Bomb, as he existed then, could basically detonate any aspect of himself and then restore it. So he was literally a walking bomb. In this instance, this guy just calls him Time Bomb because he can manipulate time. But again, it's interesting. It's a funny little situation when it comes to these things because it's small bits and pieces basically being brought back into the fray again. But as this story begins to wind down, what we end up finding out is that this time manipulation device actually belonged to a villain named Tiger Shark, who I really don't know too much about. I need to do a little more poking around about him, but it belongs to a villain named Tiger Shark. Of course, this guy basically having the intention to bring down Bloodhaven or bring Bloodhaven under his control. So again, it's this continual desire by DC to basically bolster the rogues of Nightwing himself, basically throwing at us all these different enemies that he's either faced in the past or that are being created for the first time, and then in turn asking us which one we like the most and then keeping the ones that we seem to enjoy the most. So whenever you guys heard our discussions where we talked about how, well, DC Comics would come along and they would test the waters with this character and fans loved it so they kept them around, you're experiencing that in real time right now. Characters who are old school, who are pre-New 52 being brought back to see whether or not people are interested in them. It's these small things, these cool things that really make for a cohesive story. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.